Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. And this was not something done by Congress. This was done solely by President Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So it did have a certain weight whenever he proclaimed all of this, but it wasn't, only Congress could declare war, and so it wasn't actually Congress saying it, it was just an executive order from President Lincoln. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in Confederate states that had not ceased rebellion by the beginning of the year. So, Lincoln had issued a pre-proclamation. He had said, I will be issuing a proclamation on the first of the year. If by the time that January 1st rolls around, you haven't stopped rebelling, you haven't come back and joined the Union, then you will be subject to this proclamation. And he told all of the states that in September. So they had a few months to decide this, but the Confederate states that hadn't ceased rebellion were supposed to be under the jurisdiction of the Emancipation Proclamation. So what it said was that all the slaves in those Confederate states were free now. It effectively freed them. The proclamation stated that suitable ex-slaves, also known as freedmen, could join the paid service of the United States Armed Forces. So they had to be suitable. They pretty much only took men, and they were going to want healthy, younger men that could actually do some fighting. So suitable ex-slaves could join. They could be paid to be part of the Union Army. Lincoln ordered the Union Army to recognize and maintain the freedom of all freedmen who joined. So even though it's the Union Army, there were still going to be some people who didn't think that these people that had just been slaves a couple months before should be fighting with them. So he ordered the army to make sure that their freedom was recognized and maintained because he was serious about this. And because Lincoln was freeing them and giving them the option to fight and be paid to do so, several of the freedmen did join the armed services. Almost 200,000 black men fought in the Union Army, and approximately 10,000 served in the Navy. So this added a lot to the number of soldiers and the size of the army that Lincoln commanded. So they really helped in the war effort. And similarly, the South had lost a lot of the people that had lived there. They lost a lot of their population because even if they didn't follow the Emancipation Proclamation and let their slaves go, a lot of slaves would escape and get over state lines into free states, into what was considered the Union, and then they would be free. And then a lot of them would go and fight against the South for the Union Army. The proclamation also set a precedent for the emancipation of slaves as the war progressed. So as they moved steadily south and they started to control more southern areas, they would free the slaves in those areas. And it showed that ending slavery was a goal of the Union war effort. Lincoln started out just wanting to get the Union back together. Slavery was a big issue, but it wasn't all that they were fighting for. He just wanted to get the Union back together. The South were saying, no, we're going to rebel because we want to keep our slaves. The North was saying, well, we don't like you keeping your slaves, but we still want you to be part of the Union. The Confederate States said, no, we'll just make our own country and we'll have our slaves over here. And Lincoln wanted to prevent that. He wanted to keep the country together. And so that was what the primary goal was in the beginning. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, a huge goal became freeing all of the slaves. And abolishing slavery. So that is all that the Emancipation Proclamation did do. Now, the proclamation did not free any slaves under Union control. So if there were some Confederate states that did go back under Union control by their deadline of January 1st. And the slaves in those states were not freed. They were still allowed to be kept as slaves until the end of the war. And so the Emancipation Proclamation did not actually abolish slavery. It didn't get rid of slavery altogether. It only got rid of slavery in the Confederate states that were rebelling against the Union. There was that goal of emancipating slaves as they moved south and, in the end, abolishing slavery, but the Emancipation Proclamation did not do that. It only abolished slavery and freed the slaves in the Confederate states that were not under Union control. And the proclamation did not make ex-slaves citizens. So yes, they were free, but they were not U.S. citizens yet. The Emancipation Proclamation did a lot in terms of moving forward the goal of emancipating slaves, and it enforced that freeing the slaves is going to be a major goal of the Civil War and on the northern side. And so that is why it was so important. President Abraham Lincoln showed that he wasn't messing around with the slavery issue. If the Union couldn't be returned to one whole country, then he was going to free all the slaves in the South and end this slavery thing for good. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery for good. That didn't happen until the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution after the Civil War. But the proclamation did spur people to all unite under the goal in the North, and as far as the Union went, to end slavery. The Union decided ending slavery is one of our goals now. As we move through the South, we are going to free slaves. Where the Confederate was just trying to hang on to their slaves and maintain themselves as a new country. So the Emancipation Proclamation was very important in terms of reestablishing the goal of the Civil War as freeing slaves as the Union was reunited.
Robert E. Lee is known as the commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. When, in 1861, the Civil War first broke out, President Lincoln offered Lee command of the Union Army, but Lee declined because his home state, Virginia, was threatening to secede from the Union. So originally, Robert E. Lee was asked to serve on the Union side of the Civil War, but he ended up being a general or a commander on the Confederate side. Now, when the Confederacy was established, Lee became a senior military advisor to President Jefferson Davis, because Jefferson Davis was president of the Confederacy while Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. Now, Lee led many great battles, but was unable to ever invade the North, and so he ended up surrendering in 1865. And so that's an important date to remember. The war started in 1861 and then ran until 1865. So it lasted 4 years, but it's popularly noted that it lasted 5 Aprils. And so when Lee surrendered, that's kind of known as the beginning of the end of the Confederacy, because within 2 months, the rest of the Confederate armies had also surrendered.
Today we want to go over just some of the basics related to the conflict between the North and the South that resulted in the war between the states, or the Civil War, in the 1800s, 1861 to 65. And when we think about this, often it's taught in very flat, basic terms, and things, as we know in the real world, are often much more complicated. But the basic conflict between the North and the South was not merely slavery. They had many differences, and these differences found perhaps a focal point in slavery, but there were other things as well. And so I want to go through just a few of those basic differences that led to the conflict between them that eventually precipitated out into the Civil War. First, when we think about the conflict between the North and the South, we need to think in terms of economic differences. The economy in the North and the economy in the South were based on very different things. The Northern economy was much more diversified. It had small individual farms run by individuals, and it had an industrial base. The South, by contrast, was almost uniformly economic in terms of agrarian needs. They had large-scale plantations as well as individual farms, but the economy was run on growing cash crops like cotton and tobacco, and basically you needed a lot of manpower to make that work. When we think in terms also of economics, we need to think in terms of population density. The population in the North was much more dense. There were more people in the North. The South was spread out with fewer people. And the majority of the people in the South were slaves in this case. So in terms of economics, you've got a difference in population density, a difference in focus, more diverse in the North, much more uniform in the South. And when that comes into play, then you start making people worried. If you start taking away their source of labor, you're basically threatening their livelihood. Now we're going to get to the question of morality down here below, but just in terms of economics, part of the way the South saw things was, hey, if you change things and you abolish slavery, you're actually going to destroy our economy and our livelihood and our way to make money. We don't have anything else to fall back on. So that was part of the issue then, was economic differences. Industrial and diversified in the North, agrarian in the South, large-scale plantations, cotton and tobacco primarily. Next, when we think about the conflict between the North and the South, it needs to be seen as a power issue, a political power issue. So on the federal level, what the South was hoping for was equality. Now, if the federal level is run by representation that's based on population, and there's more population in the North and less population in the South, then the South is going to say, hey, wait a minute, you're always going to get your way because you're going to have more representation because you have more population. We'd like to equalize that. And the way we're going to equalize that is we want our slave populations counted for purposes of representation. And taxation is also based on population. In that case, the South would say we don't want to be taxed on our slave population, just on our landowning population. And so the compromise that worked out, which has been called the 3/5 compromise, basically 3 out of every 5 slaves counted for purposes of representation and taxation. It was a way to boost taxation from the South and also for the South to boost representation on the federal level. Basically, the South saw this, though, as we want political equality on the federal level so you don't lord it over us and get your way and we have no say in it. But on the local level, the South very much wanted autonomy. We don't want you telling us what to do. On the local level, leave us alone. It's been said that almost every day Robert E. Lee woke up during the Civil War, looked across the lines at the North and said, I wish those people over there would go home and leave us alone. It wasn't a war of conquest on behalf of the South. They wanted to be left alone. So, economic differences, political differences, power differences, equality on the federal level, autonomy on the local level, and then we get to the whole question here of morality. And this was a big one. To those in the North, and I think to those of us today, we would say that slavery is very much a moral issue before it's ever an economic or a power issue. It's a moral issue, one human being owning another. Now, it's easy to be anachronistic here and say, well, viewed from today, we know they're wrong. If you can get, though, into their mindset of their day, this is how they thought about it. The abolitionists in the North said it's immoral and wrong, and here's our reasoning. Those who were pro-slavery in the South weren't trying to argue that, hey, we think this is indifferent morally. They actually, as a Christian culture largely, at least a Christian culture on the surface, said that the Bible nowhere condemns slavery, and if we abide by its injunctions on how we treat our slaves, we're well within morality. That's obviously easily debated, but from those in the North, the abolitionists, the standpoint was clear. It's immoral, therefore it needs to end. We don't care if it crushes your economy or if we have to do it through force of political power, it's immoral. And I think there was in the South at least a sense of fear of, well, if you've got the moral argument, then these arguments, which are important to us, hold no sway. And so it led to the inevitable conflict, I think, in some ways. But this is very much a part of this question and part of the conflict between the North and the South. And then finally, when you think in terms of social structure, the North and the South were very different Socially, the North was much more egalitarian. It had much more influx of peoples from all sorts of different areas, and even though there would obviously be squabbles between them, by and large, they were more egalitarian in their culture. Everyone had equal opportunity, could rise as far as their ability allowed, more or less. And that's sort of their mindset, was egalitarian. The South was much more stratified, much more hierarchical, much more like Britain in that sense. That everyone had a class. You were born into a certain class, you needed to know your place and keep your place. And if you were a slave, you were at the bottom of the bucket, and it went from there on up to the landed aristocracy, the landowners, basically. I'm not arguing the rightness and wrongness of that. I'm just saying that that was part of the differences that led to the conflict and why they were that way. More or less egalitarian, much more stratified and hierarchical in their view of things. These sorts of differences and many more all flowed together into that volatile time leading to that conflict. So it wasn't just a flat, easy read of, hey, the South was immoral and liked slaves, and the North was moral and hated slaves, and that's why they fought. It was issues related to economic differences, political power differences, social structure differences, and yes, differences in how they saw the moral question related to slavery. Well, this has just been a brief overview then of some of the issues related to the conflict between the North and the South. It's much more complex than we can possibly cover in this brief video, but I wanted to highlight those for us and then encourage you to study further. If you'd like to know more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information, and while you're on that website you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
About 150 years ago, from 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War occurred. Now, anytime there's a civil war, that's because there are warring factions or different sides that claim allegiance to the same country. In the case of the American Civil War, the warring factions included the Confederacy or the Southern states versus the Union or the Northern states. Now, there is a disagreement between scholars that study the Civil War period about the specific causes that led to the South seceding or leaving the Union and triggering the Civil War. However, generally, there is consensus about 5 causes that led to the beginning of the Civil War. Those causes include slavery, sectionalism, territorial crisis, national elections, and states' rights. Now, the American Civil War, as all civil wars, was and still is today our most bloody conflict. The American Civil War resulted in at least 600,000 deaths. And that's 600,000 deaths on both sides, North and South. And because most of the Civil War was fought in the South, it literally left many Southern states and communities devastated. Now, when we look at the Civil War from a military standpoint, we're primarily looking at 2 personalities. In the South, we had Robert E. Lee. By far, Robert E. Lee was one of the South's most able military commanders. Now, Robert E. Lee started off as the commander of the Army of Virginia, which was by far the South's largest unit and from the South's probably most prominent state, Virginia. Eventually, Lee would be promoted to Commander-in-Chief of Confederate forces. Then for the North, you had General Ulysses S. Grant. At the beginning of the Civil War, Lincoln, who was the president at that time, had to go through many generals in order to find one that could actually come up with a strategy to defeat the South and bring the Union back together. Eventually, Lincoln would settle on Grant. He would be promoted to be commander of all Union forces, and eventually he became the 18th president of the United States. Now, looking at the Civil War, there were many battles. Some historians would say that there was an engagement during the Civil War nearly every day from 1861 to 1865. But we see here in 1860, Lincoln was elected. The South is beginning to realize that because of their economic position, which is translating to their political position, they are losing a lot of influence in the United States when it comes to national elections. Now, 1861, Southern forces fire on Fort Sumter, where there are Union forces located. This signals the beginning of the Civil War in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. By 1863, we have this great battle in Pennsylvania called the Battle of Gettysburg. There were many casualties, and this battle was a signal of the tide turning from the South to the North, an eventual victory by 1865 at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, where Lee surrenders to Grant and the Civil War ends.
Reconstruction. There were a few different aspects to Reconstruction after the Civil War in the United States. First, we have presidential Reconstruction. And this has to do with what the president has control over. So presidential construction was largely driven by President Andrew Jackson's policies. Lincoln had not gotten to do too much with Reconstruction before his assassination. So the primary policies for presidential Reconstruction came from Andrew Jackson. And he was lenient on the South and allowed continued discrimination and control over blacks. So presidential Reconstruction really wasn't helping to reconstruct. President Andrew Jackson just quickly wanted to say, okay, everything's reconstructed, we can be one union again, everything's over, everything's good. But that wasn't really the case. Next, we have congressional Reconstruction. And this has to do with how Congress handled Reconstruction. Congress was controlled mainly by radical Republicans during this period. And they provided more civil rights for blacks and wanted more control over the Southern government. Basically, Congress wasn't ready to forgive and let the Southern governments go back to doing just what they'd been doing before. They were worried that the South would try to reinforce slavery or still keep African Americans in a lower condition or lower position than they were in. And they were right in a sense, because that did continue for a long time. The radical Republicans were just ones who were very seriously pro African Americans and anti-South. They wanted the South to be punished. They wanted to hold more control over the South to make sure they could be trusted before they were left on their own. So this was marked by military control of former Confederate state governments. So again, Congress that was made up of these radical Republicans were still worried about what the South might do if they were given free reign and could have their governments functioning however they wanted. So they have military control of these former Confederate state governments. And Congress was responsible for the Reconstruction Amendments, which were adopted from 1865 to 1870. Those were the 5 years directly following the Civil War. And so they worked to get these amendments passed. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation had granted freedom to slaves in Confederate states that were rebelling against the Union, but it didn't free all slaves. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and freed all slaves. The 14th Amendment included the privileges and immunities, due process, and equal protection clauses. So it was giving them more civil rights, more rights as U.S. citizens. And the 15th Amendment granted voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So again, more civil rights, but specifically voting rights to all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This didn't give voting rights to women, only to men, and it could be for black or white men. And the promises of these amendments were worn away by state laws in the South and federal court decisions that upheld the state's laws and went against what these constitutional amendments were giving the new black citizens. So states passed what were known as the Jim Crow laws, which limited the rights of African Americans. And so it made it hard for them to be able to vote. It made it hard for them to have the same rights and privileges as white men did at that time. Now they were free, but they were still pushed into a lower position than white people. They weren't treated the same way. They weren't given the equal treatment that they should have been given under these Reconstruction Amendments. And then finally, the last part of Reconstruction is known as redemption, which presumes that the South was redeemed and had lived up to any conditions it needed to live up to and could now be accepted back into the Union. So the Confederate States were gradually readmitted to the Union. And white Democrats took over most Southern governments. And the last troops left the South in 1877. So this is considered the last year of Reconstruction because it was when redemption was achieved. The last Union troops that had military control over those former Confederate states, they left, they retreated, and went back to their homes up north. So no more troops were there to control the governments. White Democrats swept across and took over most of the Southern governments and continued to oppress new black citizens. And the Confederate States were gradually readmitted to the Union. So they were considered redeemed, allowed back in with all the rights that they had previously as states in the Union. Now, black citizens were still going to be discriminated against for the years to come until the 1960s, when they actually were given their full rights and people were forced to acknowledge those instead of just ignoring them. The Jim Crow laws were overturned and considered unconstitutional themselves during the 1960s. But during Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Amendments were passed, giving the new black citizens more rights in name. They just didn't get them in act yet. And the Southern governments were slowly rebuilt until they were allowed to function on their own, and that was known as redemption, which ended the period known as Reconstruction.
The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution has had a huge impact on the United States. It was ratified on December 6, 1865. So the 13th Amendment was passed during the Reconstruction era. And the Reconstruction era existed after the Civil War ended. So this was a time when the Confederate states that had broken off from the whole United States were joining back together with the northern states to form one complete U.S. again. And so this was a difficult time for the country. A lot of laws had to be passed to help figure out how this was going to happen, how all these states were going to join back together. And in addition, many of the Confederate soldiers had to be granted pardons because they were considered in opposition to the U.S., and so they were committing illegal acts. And so in order for them not to go to prison, they had to be granted presidential pardons. Now, the 13th Amendment freed all slaves, and it also legally forbade slavery in the U.S. So it freed all current slaves and said that slavery could not exist again. Now, slaves were freed without giving monetary compensation to the slave holders. And this is because this was considered an illegal act now, and so it didn't make sense to give money to the people because they were doing something illegal. And it's interesting, though, because these slaveholders saw their slaves as their property. And so since they were losing their property, they would want to be compensated for it. So this was a huge financial loss to the slaveholders. Now, what kind of impact did the 13th Amendment have? Well, for one, it changed the societal composition of the South and some of the border states. Because before, African Americans were generally slaves, but now they're just normal citizens. It also changed the economy. Because like I said earlier, the slaves were considered property, and so these slaveholders had to pay for them initially, but after that, they didn't have to pay wages. Now, if they were going to hire African Americans, they had to pay them wages for their work, and so this changed the economy. In some cases, maybe it was too expensive to own these slaves or to employ these slaves. And so it created economic change in the South. And then civil rights was also born after the 13th Amendment happened, because now at first the idea was these African Americans needed to be free from slavery. But now that they've been freed, they're not on equal ground with the white people of the U.S. And so that's what happened with the civil rights movement, pretty much starting at this point all the way up into not that long ago, as African Americans and others on their behalf were fighting for equal rights to that of the other Americans. Now, to give you a full context of the 13th Amendment, it has two sections, and so Section 1 says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So this was saying, like I said earlier, that slavery can never exist again. People could only be made to work, basically, if it was punishment for a crime that they had been convicted for. And so basically what was happening is these slaves were being treated like criminals, even though they were not. And then Section 2 says Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And so that's some of the legislation I was talking about that was born out of the Reconstruction era. So this 13th Amendment was passed, but now other laws had to be put in place to help this process of the slaves being freed go smoothly. The 14th Amendment was ratified on July 9, 1868, during the Reconstruction era of the United States. The 14th Amendment declared that all persons born or naturalized were U.S. citizens. So basically, if someone was born in the U.S. or naturalized, they were considered a U.S. citizen. And then it also declared that all citizens were entitled to equal rights regardless of race. So the 14th Amendment basically did two things. First, it defined who a U.S. citizen was, and then it said that all of these citizens have equal rights. Now, the amendment fell short of giving black men the right to vote, but it paved the way for the 15th Amendment, which did give black men the right to vote. Now, this amendment angered women's rights activists because it made the right to vote a male right. And it wasn't much later until the 19th Amendment that women were given the right to vote. Now, the major impact of the 14th Amendment was that human rights were granted at the state as well as the national level through the Due Process Clause. So I'm going to write that on the board because that's really important to remember, the Due Process Clause. So the 14th Amendment said that all people, all citizens, cannot be convicted of a crime unless they've been through the due process of law. And so we could also say that the 14th Amendment granted due process to all citizens. So basically these minority groups, or the black people, couldn't be discriminated against by the court system. They were given the same rights to a fair trial under the Bill of Rights that white Americans were given as well. So again, the 14th Amendment did basically two things. It defined who U.S. citizens were and said that they were all given equal rights. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Now, this 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. It passed because Confederate states were forced to comply based on the Military Reconstruction Act. The Military Reconstruction Act was passed a few years prior by Congress, despite President Johnson's veto. And so this put the Confederate states under military control to aid in the process of reconstruction of the southern states being joined together again with the northern states. And so as part of the Military Reconstruction Act, they had to pass the 15th Amendment. And women's rights activists also opposed the amendment because it granted the right to vote to males only. So you can see how much opposition and tension there was with the 15th Amendment because women's rights activists opposed it, as well as these Confederate and Southern states who had a lot of prejudice against blacks. And so really only through the Military Reconstruction Act could the 15th Amendment most likely come about. Now, women also wanted the right to vote, or these women rights activists wanted the right to vote as well. And so that didn't come about until the 19th Amendment, which came about much later. And so they opposed it because this amendment was making the right to vote a male right only. Because although it was giving it to blacks, and so now it wasn't, before it was just a white male right, and now it was cutting across cultural lines. And so now no longer was it a right of one ethnicity, but it was still just a right of one gender. And so the push for women's rights eventually resulted in the 19th Amendment. But here we're just focusing on the 15th Amendment, and this was the last of three very historic amendments in the U.S. relating to Reconstruction. And that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And these had a huge impact on life in the U.S. because they put an end to the era of slavery and were the first steps in giving freedom and equal rights to black people at the state and national levels. Up here on the board are 12 landmark Supreme Court cases. So Baker versus Carr established the principle of one person, one vote. What that means is that legislative districts must contain the same amount of people, because if they do not, then some people will be more represented than others. And then it also ruled that redistricting cases can be heard by federal courts, because since redistricting is a state issue, the idea here was that, well, these kind of cases can't be heard by federal courts, but Baker versus Carr ruled that they can be. And then there's Brown versus Board of Education, sometimes known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. And it ruled that separate educational facilities are unequal. So the case made it illegal for racial segregation to exist within public education facilities. Before, the idea was that the races could be segregated as long as the facilities are equal. But this case found that the supposedly equal public facilities were not actually equal. And then there's Gideon versus Wainwright, which established the right to free legal counsel. And then there's Korematsu versus the U.S., which allowed the government to place Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. Mapp versus Ohio was a case regarding that evidence gathered in violation of the Fourth Amendment can't be used. So what's the Fourth Amendment? Well, the Fourth Amendment outlines how evidence can be found. It deals with search warrants. So say, for example, that a police officer entered a home without a search warrant, but they found incriminating evidence. Well, that evidence cannot be used in a court of law because the evidence was gathered in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And then there's Marbury versus Madison, which established judicial review. This is an extremely important court case. It took place in 1803, and it really set a precedent for all of the Supreme Court cases that have followed. And so the Supreme Court decided that it had the power to invalidate a statute which it found to be in violation of the Constitution. So this is a check and a balance system, because if Congress passes a law and then the president signs it, that law can't just go into effect even if it violates the Constitution. The Supreme Court is there as a check on the power of the other two branches. And so they can strike down a statute if they find it in conflict with the Constitution. And then there's McCulloch versus Maryland, which established the authority of national law over state law. So specifically, McCulloch versus Maryland concerned whether the national government had the legal power to establish a national bank. And so the state of Maryland was opposed to the national bank. So in an effort to drive it out, it taxed the Maryland branch of the bank. So this case found that the national government did have the legal power to have such a bank. But that's not what made this case famous. What made it famous is that, in addition, the court established that the national government, as long as it is abiding by the Constitution, is supreme over state law. So if national law and state law are in conflict with each other, state law has to budge. And then there's Miranda versus Arizona. This court, in this case, the court ruled that the Fifth Amendment requires the arrested to be told legal rights. So this is known as the Miranda rights. Whenever law enforcement arrests someone, they have to inform them of their rights. A couple of these rights that are well known are the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel. And then Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that established the legality of separate but equal. Now that sounds slightly familiar because we just talked about that with Brown versus Board of Education. So all these court cases are up here in alphabetical order, not chronological. So Plessy versus Ferguson actually came before Brown versus Board of Education. And so Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. But at this time, this court decided that separate but equal facilities were okay, and so that was the law of the land at the time. And then there's Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. And this banned quota systems in the college admissions process. But it ruled that programs providing advantages to minorities are constitutionally sound. Because what was happening here is that in an effort to increase minority enrollment, they had these quota systems in place to help minorities. But the court ruled that the quota systems were hurting the majority. So while it banned the quota systems, it still allowed the other programs providing advantages to minorities. And then Roe versus Wade overturned most state laws prohibiting abortion. Then Scott versus Sanford was later overturned, and it said that African Americans could never be granted U.S. citizenship. So like I said, this was overturned by the 14th Amendment, but at the time, this was the law of the land. And so this applied to all African Americans, whether enslaved or free. Now, this case is a lot of times more well known as Dred Scott versus Sanford, or known as the Dred Scott case, because Dred Scott was trying to become a U.S. citizen. But because the court decided that African Americans could never be granted U.S. citizenship, then the court also ruled that Dred Scott didn't even have a right to bring this case to court, because only U.S. citizens have that right. So in their ruling, they really invalidated Dred Scott's whole case because they said that he could never even be a U.S. citizen. So that's a look at some landmark Supreme Court cases.
The Progressive Era, an overview. The Progressive Era was a time period in the United States from about 1890 to 1920. And it did overlap a little bit with the era of American imperialism, where the United States was branching out and getting more involved in world affairs. But progressivism, or the Progressive Era, was something more focused at home in the United States. And it was focused on making reforms and changes to the government. It is important to note that progressivism is not synonymous with socialism. Progressives wanted to change the system, while socialists wanted to destroy it altogether. So progressives saw some good in the current system that was in place in the United States, but they saw a lot of areas that change would be beneficial. And so they were pushing for change, for government reforms, for policy reforms, just changes in the way people specifically were treated, especially those that were in the poorer class. Progressives believed that the government should regulate all business, and this was so businesses could not take advantage of the little people, of the people who were poor, who were in lower socioeconomic classes. So if the government was regulating businesses, they couldn't tax too much, they couldn't charge too much for a product, and they couldn't make inferior products that weren't safe for the American people to use or consume. Moreover, progressives wanted to take government out of the hands of the rich and put it into the hands of the common people. So there were way fewer rich people than there were poor or middle class people who were considered the common people. So progressives wanted to take the government out of the hands of the rich who weren't going to be regulating business because they would want to make more money from business, and put it into the hands of the common people who could do more good for all of the common people. The rich people might not like it as much, but the common people would be benefited. Often progressives had difficulty getting organized. This problem had been the death knell of the populists, who had been around a few decades before with similar interests. But the progressives were able to succeed in spite of their turmoil because they had strong leaders. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. These were all strong leaders who also became presidents of the United States and were able to further the interest of the progressive movement. The progressive philosophy was started by a small minority of liberal intellectuals, including William James and Henry Adams. Among the authors who wrote on progressive themes were Jacob Riis, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, Frank Norris, who wrote The Octopus on Railroad Corruption, and Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle on corruption in the meatpacking industry. So, along with having this philosophy started by a minority of liberals, that they had authors who were furthering the ideals of progressivism. So Jacob Riis wrote How the Other Half Lives. His book was primarily photographs, and it was photographs of the poorer people in tenement housing in New York City. And he took pictures to show the world how people were living, how the other half was living. So the rich people, the wealthier upper class people, he kind of thought they just don't know what's going on. If they know, if they can see how the other half lives, how the poorer half lives, then they would be morally bound to help them. So he was trying to put the issues out there to let everyone know how the poor people were living, what squalor they were living in, the terrible conditions that they were living in, and try to get some help for them from the richer classes. Frank Norris wrote The Octopus on Railroad Corruption. So within the railroad industry, there was also corruption. His book focused more on California and the wheat production and then transportation via railroad of that wheat and different problems that arose, or conflicts that arose between the railroad industry, the company that was in California, and the farmers growing the wheat. And Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle on corruption in the meat packing industry. Now, he actually wrote The Jungle trying to also point out how the other half lives. He was also trying to point out how poorer people lived, what kind of conditions they lived in, only he was focusing in Chicago. However, his book was not taken that way. The poor immigrant that he was focusing on, that was his main character, worked in a series of meatpacking plants, and in in describing his jobs, he exposed different kinds of malpractices in the meatpacking industry. He alleged that animals such as rats and people would fall into the vats and be ground up to go and be fed to the people, to wealthy people as well as poor people. And so whenever people read the book, they completely overlooked the part about the plight of the poor immigrants coming into the United States and focused on the poor sanitary conditions and what was allowed to happen in the meatpacking plants. And so as a result of the jungle, there was a lot more regulation on food food production and packaging to make sure all that was sanitary before it got sent out for people to actually purchase and consume. The Individual Workers of the World, established in 1905 by Big Bill Haywood and known as the Wobblies, was a radical and militant labor union that appealed to unskilled workers. The progressives were pro-labor unions, and since the progressives were pushing the issue of the common people, unskilled workers were going to fit into that lower class, the poorer class, the more common people. They weren't going to be able to compete with the upper class elite, with the rich business owners, but if they joined together, all of these unskilled workers, into a labor union that was organized, that group of people could be very powerful and could go up against the big businesses. So this was one of the labor unions that was more radical and militant than most during the Progressive Era. There were some interesting state and local experiments during this period. And by experiments, we just mean that people were trying out different things. Progressivism was all about change. It was all about reform. And so people were trying different ways of doing things, different ways of handling the government, different ways of handling business, of handling education. And so they called them experiments because there were things that weren't going on everywhere. One city or one state may take up these ideas and put them into practice, but not the whole country. So some examples. In Galveston, Texas, the city switched to a commission system in which the heads of various departments were elected. So whenever you have this commission and it is only governed by heads of departments that are elected, it's only people that have actually been chosen by the common people to represent the city. You're not going to have people appointed. You're not going to have one person in charge, like the mayor of a city, appointing these heads of departments. The heads of departments had to be elected by the common people. So they had a voice in Galveston, Texas during this time, during this local experiment. In Stanton, Virginia, the office of mayor was done away with in favor of a managing council. So this is similar to what happened in Galveston, except the managing council wasn't necessarily replacing heads of departments, but it did mean that instead of one person being in charge, the mayor, you now had a managing council who was in charge of this city. Robert La Follette's many reforms in Wisconsin led Roosevelt to refer to this state as the laboratory of democracy. So this whole state had a lot of reforms during the Progressive era. La Follette tied the university system, the railroads, and the banks to state government. So all of these things were tied to the state's government, and that meant that the state government was going to have more control over these things within Wisconsin, which meant that the common people could have more of a voice over what was going on. If they were just controlled individually as businesses, the railroads and the banks and the universities being considered businesses, and if they were allowed to regulate themselves, things might not work out as well for the common people. But when they're all tied to state government and being controlled by state government, the common people are going to have more of a voice. And then Governor Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey planned to use corporate taxes to pay for public education. So here is another state who would be using corporate taxes collected to pay for public education of New Jersey citizens. So there were a lot of different things being tried and tested in different states and cities throughout the United States. The Progressive Era was all about change. People were looking for big changes from big business and corporations being in charge of things to the common people having more of a voice in the say of how government was run and how money was handled. The corporations got a lot of tax cuts. They've had loopholes to get out of paying taxes, and so the rich kept getting richer while the poor either stayed the same or lived in worse and worse conditions. So throughout the Progressive Era, you had people and authors who were putting issues out there for the common people. They were trying to find ways to change things to better life for the common people. So that is the main theme you'll see throughout the Progressive Era, which was around 1890 to around 1920.
The Second Industrial Revolution. It started in 1860 with the start of Bessemer Steel and ran through the beginning of World War I. Now, this was characterized by things like the mass production system, assembly lines, which were all things that helped companies run more efficiently and make their product more efficient as well. Now, the Second Industrial Revolution is not as well known as the first, but it's a separate industrial revolution because it took place at a different time than the first, and it pertained to different things. Now, this industrial revolution was more science-based. It pertained to things more science-related, as well as things like electricity and railroads. Now, it started much like the first. It started in Europe, Western Europe to be specific, and then moved to the US and Japan. This was a time when companies became a lot more efficient, like I said earlier, and one person has referred to it as the Age of Synergy, which is a good way to wrap up what the Second Industrial Revolution was. The Great Depression was a severe worldwide economic recession that started in 1930. It was a very complex event, but I have a few main points that I want to highlight that I wrote up on the board. First of all, economists differ as to how it started. Some believe it was caused by bank failures and the stock market crash. Stocks prices started decreasing in 1929, and the stock market crashed later that year on what is known as Black Tuesday. Now, other economists believe it was caused by the Federal Reserve and its poor monetary policies during that time. Now, let's take a look at the effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment skyrocketed. In fact, in the U.S., it rose to levels around 25%. Also, tax revenue, profits, prices, and international trade all decreased during this time. It's important to remember that the Great Depression did not just occur in the U.S. It occurred in countries all across the world. So it stands to reason that if two countries were in a severe economic recession, such as the Great Depression, that trade between the two countries would be severely decreased. In fact, international trade was cut in half at some points during the Great Depression. Industries that depended on natural resources, such as farming and mining and logging, were especially hit hard by the Great Depression. Also, things like construction were often halted in countries across the world. Now, since the Great Depression was happening in so many different countries, the recovery of countries did not all happen simultaneously. Countries' economies started to bounce back at different times. Some economies recovered as early as the late 1930s, while others took about till the mid-1940s. It is believed that the start of World War II either ended the Great Depression or masked its problems. Because during World War II, industry was severely increased during this time. because the government was pumping money into the economy to manufacture things for the war. In fact, this helped the economic growth rate double in the U.S. Also, unemployment went down during this time. In fact, in the U.S., it went below 10% because of World War II. Not only were people being employed in the armed forces, they were also being employed in manufacturing to manufacture things for the war. So overall, the Great Depression is known as the worst economic recession of the 20th century. The Roaring Twenties was an interesting time for the world. In the US, the 1920s was also known as the Jazz Age, or the Roaring Twenties, because it was a time of great economic prosperity. However, this prosperity was not felt worldwide. In fact, it was economic problems that led to the rise of the Nazi Party. A lot of the economic problems were caused by massive debt from the Treaty of Versailles that resulted from World War I. Massive urbanization occurred in the U.S. during the 1920s. For the first time in U.S. history, more people lived in urban areas than they did in rural areas during the 1920s. Communism was also on the rise in many countries as it spread throughout the world. And to counteract communism, fascism became more popular to stop the spread of communism. Russia also started to favor a more mixed economy in which socialism was more prevalent during the 1920s. Now, I said that the 1920s was a time of great economic prosperity for the U.S. However, the great stock market crash in 1929 that helped spark the Great Depression helped put a damper on the economic prosperity of the U.S. during the 1920s. So that's a brief look at the 1920s and what changes it entailed. American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is the greatest nation on earth. Basically, it's a high perception of the United States. This idea of American exceptionalism is very popular with Americans. This makes sense because people living in the United States want to have a high view of the country in which they are living. De Tocqueville was from France, and he came to the U.S. and observed the U.S. and wrote about his findings. He promoted the view of American exceptionalism. In fact, he wrote that basically the U.S. was headed down a path of no limit, that the U.S. could accomplish anything it wanted to because it was the greatest nation on earth, that it could always achieve its dreams because it had the means to do so. The idea of American exceptionalism comes about because U.S. citizens and others believe that the U.S.'s history, culture, and governmental structure is unsurpassed. Namely, they believe that the U.S. citizens have more freedom than those in other countries, and that is what makes it great, and that is why they believe that America is exceptional. The 19th century was an exciting time for the world as many new advances and transformations came about. During this time period, the collapse of many empires took place, which allowed new empires to form, like the British Empire, and America started to become a world power. Also, slavery came to an end in Britain and Brazil, as well in the U.S. after the ratification of the 13th Amendment following the end of the Civil War. Also, advances in numerous fields came about, like medicine and technology. Many new inventions came about, the Industrial Revolution was started, and railroads started to be used, which led to urbanization in many countries, meaning that people from rural areas moved to urban areas, bringing the population of many cities to over 1 million inhabitants. A great example is London. At the beginning of the century, it had about 1 million residents. By the end of the century, it had become the capital of the British Empire and had almost 7 million residents. Also, geographical discoveries happened in the interior of Asia and Africa. Many of these places had either not been discovered or explored very thoroughly, but by the end of the 19th century, they had. World War I was the sixth largest conflict in history. It started in 1914 and ended in 1918, and all of the fighting took place in Europe. At that time, Austria-Hungary was at odds with countries around it. So when someone assassinated the Archduke of Austria, the war began. Austria-Hungary then invaded Serbia, and Germany invaded Belgium and Luxembourg. Previously agreed on alliances escalated the war very quickly, because when one country joined the war, another country would have to join a war with it because they were in an alliance. The two sides of the war were the Allies and the Central Powers. The countries among the Allies were the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and the countries among the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. There were many other smaller countries involved, and other countries got involved in the war as the war progressed, as was the case with the United States, who eventually joined the side of the Allies. They helped bring about an end to the war by forcing Germany to surrender on what is now known as Armistice Day. Now, an armistice does not mean that the war is over. It just means that fighting has ceased. So the Allies signed an individual treaty with each country of the Central Powers to bring about an end to the war. The most well-known treaty is the Treaty of Versailles that the Allies signed with Germany. The Allies punished Germany for helping bring about a start to the war, and resentment caused by the Treaty of Versailles helped start World War II. The League of Nations also came about after World War I. It was a precursor to the United Nations, which exists today, and it was a council of nations to try to keep another war from happening. So that is a brief look at World War I.
World War I, an overview. In the years before the First World War, the Balkans were attempting to gain independence from the Habsburg Empire of Austria. So the Balkans were a conglomeration of city-states on the Balkan Peninsula. And so different city-states within the Balkans or that resided geographically on the Balkan Peninsula didn't like being a part of the Austrian Empire, and so they were trying to gain their independence from Austria. The insurrection from this independence movement culminated in the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 by Gavrilo Princip, a member of a Serbian nationalist group. So, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in line for the throne. He was an heir to the throne. And so, since the Serbian nationalist group, Serbia being one of these Balkan city-states, had sent a member of their group to assassinate this Austrian Archduke, there was a big problem here. And at this point, a chain reaction of war declarations spurred by the comprehensive alliances of the time ensued. So because lots of different nations in Europe at this time had formed alliances, when one country declared war, other countries in their alliance were supposed to back them up. So obviously, Austria was going to declare war against Serbia because Serbia had sent one of its members to assassinate the Austrian heir. Then Germany and Turkey joined with the Austrians. Germany and Austria had been in the Triple Alliance together, therefore Germany was supposed to back up Austria, and it did, and Turkey also joined with them. Russia declared war on these countries in support of Serbia. So Russia agreed and said, yes, you should be independent. We're going to back you up against the Austrians. France joined with Russia because France, Russia, and Britain had been in the Triple Entente alliance together. And Britain and Italy joined with France, even though Italy had been a member of the Triple Alliance. Originally, Italy, Germany, and Austria were the members of the Triple Alliance, the larger powers of Europe that were members of the Triple Alliance. But Italy backed out on that alliance and instead sided with the Triple Entente group. Despite the fact that almost every nation in Europe had entered into this war, most Europeans thought the conflict would be brief. They figured, okay, we've all backed up the people we're supposed to back up. Now this war is just going to end quickly and things will go back to normal. But that's not what happened. Instead, advances in weapons technology made the war bloody and excruciatingly slow. Much of the fighting was done from trenches. So the soldiers would hide in trenches until they could make a move forward or until they could perform some kind of military maneuver to get some ground. But a lot of the time they were hiding in their trenches waiting. And some battles saw the deaths of thousands of soldiers at one time. So this did become a very bloody war. The war was also slow because the sides were very evenly matched. Large countries had come to back up both Austria and Serbia, which meant that the sides ended up being evenly matched by the size of the countries, the availability of troops and supplies, and so being evenly matched, it made it harder for you to just instantly win. You weren't going to win quickly if the sides were evenly matched. If no one had declared war with Austria, if Germany and Turkey hadn't backed them up and had instead backed up Serbia, then Austria would have been all alone against almost every other European nation, and they would have lost quickly. But since large countries had come to both of these smaller countries' defenses, now they're pretty evenly matched. At least until 1917, when the United States entered on the side of Britain, which means they would have been backing up Serbia as well, but really they were there because Britain was there and they had another kind of alliance of their own where the United States said, okay, I'll help you, Britain. They weren't necessarily saying, I'm going to help Serbia, but in the chain reaction of people declaring, or countries declaring war, that is what they were doing. Also in 1917, the Russians exited the war via the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And Russia was basically exhausted after suffering through a revolution in 1917 in which the Bolsheviks came to power. So Russia wasn't trying to bail on Serbia after declaring their support. They just were exhausted. They didn't have the troops, they didn't have the supplies, they were already messed up internally because they had had this internal revolution, and so they signed a treaty all on their own and backed out of World War I. And the entry of the United States provided the British and French with supplies. So where things may have been running low, where some of these other countries, Germany, Turkey, Austria, may have blocked off supply lines to the countries on Serbia's side, now the United States was bringing in fresh supplies for Britain and France. And troops. They sent over troops as well. So where thousands had died, now the Serbian side was getting more troops, where the Austrian side didn't have any new troops coming forward. And Germany was soon forced to call a truce. And even though it was Austria and Serbia that had originally started this war, Germany was the biggest country in power over on the Austrian side, so it came to Germany to call a truce, because once that biggest country decided they were going to end up calling a truce and backing down, the other countries would have to do the same. So World War II started because one little country was trying to gain independence from another country. When the one little country sent an assassin to go World War I, European alliances. In the early years of the 20th century, relations among the various European powers were complex. Some of these European nations had once been all united under one empire, some of these nations had been conquered by some of the other nations, and there were different tensions underlying the relationships between these different nations. Ever since the Franco-Prussian War, so the war between France and Prussia, which was won by Prussia, the two sides had been enemies, and Prussia was an area that was usually considered part of Germany or a very close alliance of Germany. So after this Franco-Prussian War, which Prussia won, France and Prussia were very much enemies. And at the center of their conflict was the territory of Alsace-Lorraine. They both wanted this territory, and they both claimed it as their own. So this was a territory that was still disputed. And during this time, people were still supposed to be practicing the balance of power, where one country wouldn't try to overtake all the other countries in Europe. They would stick to their own territory and not try to branch out into any of the other European nations. In order to bolster their position in the region, France and Prussia, each side entered into networks of alliances. If they joined with other countries and formed an alliance, then they would be stronger. And both sides had this idea. Both sides joined with other countries who had an alliance. So they had this pact where if one of them went to war, the other members of the alliance would back them up so that one side should be stronger than the other. If France was by itself, but Prussia was in an alliance with other countries, then all those countries together would be able to defeat France. But since France also joined an alliance, there's the alliance France joined and the alliance Prussia joined, and all the countries that made those up. And so it wasn't necessarily going to be as uneven a contest if there was some kind of battle to go on for this territory. After years of negotiation, two main alliances held the major European powers. So there were some other European countries, but the major powers, the bigger countries that held more power economically and politically in the region, were formed into these alliances. So the alliance known as the Triple Alliance contained Germany, Austria, and Italy. And remember, Prussia was part of Germany, or a very close ally, so Prussia would have fit in with the Triple Alliance as part of Germany. And they teamed up with Austria and with Italy. And then the Triple Entente contained France, Britain, and Russia. So France joined with Britain and Russia. So if these two sides were to go to war for this piece of territory or for any other matter, then the sides would be pretty equally matched. They both had three of the major powers within their alliance. So if Austria were to go to war with Russia, Italy and Germany would have to back up Austria, France and Britain would have to back up Russia. So that was how these alliances were supposed to play out. If one country was attacked, the other countries in their alliance would step in to help them. And these two alliances would end up being the opposing sides in the Great War of the ensuing years. So the early years of the 20th century would be like 1900 to 1914, since 1914 is when World War I actually started. So during those years was when all of this was going on. France and Prussia had this controversy because they both wanted and claimed Alsace-Lorraine for themselves. The two countries each joined alliances. All of the major European powers split up into these two major alliances, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, and these two alliances would be the opposing sides in the coming war. World War I. Outcomes. As World War I wound down, some big changes took place within the participating countries, especially in Germany. Germany was the biggest country on the losing side of this war, so Germany was going to take the hardest hit as things were changing. A disgruntled German populace ousted the emperor and installed a moderate socialist government. So the German populace, the people, were unhappy that Germany had gotten dragged into this war and now Germany had lost and now they were going to be punished because of the political decisions. So they got rid of the emperor who had been in charge during this time and they installed a moderate socialist government in its place. This government, known as the Weimar Republic, lasted until 1933. At the Paris Peace Conference, the victors of the war and that would be the United States, Britain, France, and Italy, exacted some revenge on Germany. The victors had all lost troops and used supplies to fight Germany and the other countries that had joined with Germany. So now they were exacting some revenge on Germany since they had lost people because of Germany and their side of the war. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles penalized Germany economically and territorially. And this came about in the form of Alsace-Lorraine becoming independent. And this had been a big source of conflict. Prussia, which was part of Germany, really wanted Alsace-Lorraine, but Alsace-Lorraine wanted to become independent. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles said Alsace-Lorraine will be independent. It will no longer belong to Germany. And then the German military was dismantled. So this was also going to help keep Germany from being able to rise back up and fight the victors anytime soon. It would take a while before Germany would be able to reestablish a military and be able to even try to fight if they tried to do so in the future. The Treaty of Versailles would need to be modified by two subsequent agreements. So these were two of the biggest punishments for Germany, but there were other parts of the Treaty of Versailles that also penalized Germany. And the Treaty of Versailles ended up needing to be modified by two subsequent agreements because it wasn't very fair to Germany. Yes, they wanted to exact some revenge, but they didn't want Germany to forever be struggling. They wanted Germany to become a powerful nation again, just not one that would rise up against them. So in 1925, the treaties of Locarno outlined a more reasonable reparations plan for Germany. So a more reasonable plan for them to pay back for what they had taken away from the victors and also to rebuild within their country. And then in 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Pact asserted that diplomacy rather than force would be used to resolve any future international conflicts. So this was kind of an upgrade from the balance of powers that was struck before World War I, where all of the European nations said, okay, I won't try to attack any of my neighbors, so my neighbors won't try to attack any of me. And so each country was supposed to just be happy with the territory that it was already taking over. It wasn't supposed to try to invade any of the neighboring countries or take over them or form all of Europe into an empire. And that balance of power was struck for a while and kept things peaceful. But with World War I breaking out, that set different alliances fighting, and it was going to realign some of the borders, and that Alsace-Lorraine became independent, and Germany was also going to lose some other territory that it had previously claimed. So in the future, even if there is some kind of conflict, diplomacy is supposed to be used rather than force, according to the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And so that was something that all of the countries were supposed to be agreeing to, not just Germany, but that was also going to apply to Germany. So this was a later agreement that kind of modified what the Treaty of Versailles had said. So outcomes of World War I, all the countries had lost a lot of people, all the countries had lost a lot of their supplies, used a lot of food to power the troops, used a lot of ammunition. Germany was definitely punished after World War I, and they changed their government from having an emperor to installing a moderate socialist government. They also lost Alsace-Lorraine, and their military was dismantled. So Germany was punished. It was having to pay for its war crimes, basically. And the Treaty of Versailles was what struck a peace between everyone, but also outlined how Germany would be penalized. There were 2 later amendments that gave Germany a more reasonable reparations plan, and then a second agreement that applied to all European nations that was saying that the countries would use diplomacy rather than force to resolve any future conflicts.
World War II was the largest military conflict in U.S. history. World War II was an extremely complex event with much more to talk about than we have time to right now. But I do want to highlight a few main points about World War II that you should know. First of all, it started in 1939 and ended in 1945. Now, when talking about the war in the context of the U.S. did not enter the war until 1941. World War II was essentially the Allied powers versus the Axis powers. So instead of just 2 countries fighting against each other, it was groups of countries fighting against another groups of countries who were joined together by treaties. The Allied powers were primarily made up of the U.S., the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, whereas the Axis powers were primarily Italy, Germany, and Japan. So there were many more smaller countries on both sides of the conflict, but those were the main countries that had the largest influence in the war. Essentially, what happened is Japan wanted to become a large power in East Asia. So it was already at war over there prior to 1939. Now, Germany started to invade Poland, and then France and Britain declared war on Germany. Basically, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, wanted to increase the size of Germany by conquering other countries around it and making those countries part of Germany. In addition, the Holocaust refers to the harsh treatment of Jews and other political enemies of Adolf Hitler. Different political enemies were put into concentration camps where they were treated extremely poorly, and many of them died. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. Over 100 million people were involved in it, so as you can imagine, millions and millions of people died from the conflict. It was interesting because during World War II, countries weren't involved in a war and involved in domestic things. All of their domestic resources were put into the war. Their scientific resources, their manufacturing resources, all were put into trying to win the war. World War II is the only time in a war that nuclear warfare has been put into place. What happened in 1941 is Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, a port in Hawaii of the U.S. So that's when the U.S. started joining the war in 1941. So to help bring about the end of the war, in what is known as D-Day, Allied forces invaded the beach on Germany and eventually conquered Berlin, and Germany had an unconditional surrender that helped bring about the end of the war in Germany. But since it was a world war and it was taking place all throughout the world, simply conquering and capturing Berlin was not enough to bring an end to the conflict. Japan was still alive and well during that time. So by the U.S. dropping 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan, the U.S. was helped to bring about Japan's surrender. Now, when World War II was over, world powers did not want to see another war like this come about. So the United Nations was created with larger countries and more influential countries in the world having a larger say in the dealings of the United Nations. Also, the Cold War, which came later after World War II, came about because of World War II. World War II basically set the stage for the Cold War because since the Soviet Union and the U.S. were both on the Allied side, they both came out of the war as winners and were superpowers. And so the 2 superpowers kind of faced off in the Cold War, which was to come after World War II.
World War II, Germany. British Prime Minister Chamberlain tried to forestall German aggression at the Munich Conference in 1938. But Germany continued its expansion. So Germany had already begun to be a little aggressive. They had already moved troops into lands that they weren't supposed to occupy at all. And Prime Minister Chamberlain said, okay, let's call everyone together and try to talk this out and come to a peaceful understanding. He favored diplomacy over war. But even though Hitler attended the Munich Conference, it didn't stop his aggression. Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939. And then, during the same year, Hitler signed a secret agreement with Stalin, pledging not to attack Russia so long as Russia stayed out of German affairs. So Russia was kind of a big country in the middle of things, but Germany said, okay, we'll sign an agreement with you, Russia, as long as you don't try to interfere in what we're doing, we won't attack you. So basically, if they just kind of kept their eyes closed and didn't pay attention to Germany taking over all of their neighboring countries, then Russia wouldn't be attacked. Hitler then declared war on and conquered Poland. So Hitler has taken over Czechoslovakia, taken over Poland, signed an agreement with Russia saying, you're not going to interfere with this. And at this step, Great Britain and France were finally forced to declare war on Germany. Britain and France had also been taking a we're not really going to pay attention and hope this goes away kind of attitude to the situation. Prime Minister Chamberlain had brought the Munich Conference together, but after diplomacy didn't do any good, Great Britain and France still didn't try to step in militarily and stop anything that Hitler was doing. However, Britain had told Poland that if Hitler invaded or Poland's independence was threatened, Great Britain would stick up for Poland. So when Poland was conquered, Great Britain and France were finally forced to declare war on Germany and actually try to stop the problem. By this time, Germany was a dominating military adversary. So at this time, Germany had already built up a lot of forces, conquered a lot of land, and Germany was very strong by the time that Britain and France finally declared war on Germany. New advances in motorized military vehicles made it possible for Germany to conquer large areas of land very quickly in a new form of warfare called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And the reason it was called this is because it happened so quickly. German forces would usually come in behind an enemy and make advances into the enemy line and then quickly make it to their center and then kind of surround them. And the enemy could never reform its front very well because the motorized military vehicles moved in so quickly. They had weapons on them. They came with people on foot that were also armed. And often they were accompanied by aircraft that also was weaponized. So all of this happened very quickly, all at once, and it pushed forward quickly and then would surround an enemy or at least break up the front so much so that the enemy was overwhelmed and didn't know what to do. And so Germany was able to conquer large areas of land very quickly this way instead of it being a slow process. The Axis powers, which was the alliance that Germany was a part of, conquered almost the entire European continent. Including France over the course of 1940. So you also had Italy and Japan that were taking over places that they shouldn't be taking over. They were trying to take territory that had not previously belonged to them, according to the peaceful settlement that was made after World War I. So it may have been something they owned in the past, but it wasn't something they were supposed to own based on the boundaries that were decided after peace agreements after World War I. So the Axis powers were these three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan primarily, that were invading and taking over other countries. Now, in Europe, Germany was the biggest one that was doing all this, and so they're the ones that get the most focus. Germany gets the most focus because Germany was doing the most damage and taking over the most area. Only Great Britain remained in opposition at this point. So, over the course of 1940, when even France was taken over, in Europe, Great Britain was pretty much the only opposition left to tell Germany, hey, you can't take over all of Europe. And the Nazis undertook a ferocious aerial assault on the British. So they tried to drop bombs and shoot from planes. They didn't try to come in on land. And at this time, the British were led by Winston Churchill. There was a changeover in the government there. Prime Minister Chamberlain wanted Britain to be united at this time. If they were going to war, he wanted all parties behind the government. And all political parties at this time were not in agreement and would not follow Chamberlain. But they would follow Winston Churchill. So Chamberlain resigned and Churchill stepped up as Prime Minister. Chamberlain did still head up part of Churchill's war cabinet, his group of advisors that helped him decide what he should do at different points along the path in the war, but he did die about 6 months after he resigned. So it was good that they did have a smooth changeover of government, or things might have gone differently. So at this point, when Great Britain's the only country left in Europe that isn't taken over by Germany and is the only opposition, Winston Churchill is in power. However, Germany, failed to do enough damage to make an invasion practical. And this is because Britain is an island nation. So that's why they were practicing all this aerial assault on Britain. They couldn't just come in from the land. They would have to come in off the water onto land. And getting to a shore where you could easily get onto land was going to be hard, because any areas like that were going to be heavily guarded. And if you're trying to come in on ship, you don't have as much advantage as someone who's on land already, especially if you have like the higher ground. So it was not practical for Germany to invade on land. The area assault failed, and Hitler was a little discouraged. So instead, he turned east and decided to violate his truce with Stalin. Germany invaded Russia in 1941. He said, okay, can't go any more to the west. Britain has been too much of a problem, haven't been able to conquer it, too much trouble to try to go by land and take over. So I'm just going to go the other direction, and I'm going to invade Russia. And he did this even though he'd promised not to in this earlier agreement, as long as Russia didn't interfere. Russia hadn't interfered, but Germany was invading anyway. And he overwhelmed much of the Soviet military and advanced deep into Russian territory in a huge surprise offensive. And it was a surprise for Russia, because even though there may have been some rumors that, oh, Hitler was going to invade us one day, they really thought, for the most part, that they were safe. The government, at least, was thinking, okay, we made this pact with Hitler, we're not messing with him, we're not trying to stop him from whatever he's doing, so everything's going to be okay. So they were very surprised and were completely overwhelmed whenever German troops did invade, and Hitler was able to get pretty far into Russian territory before he was stopped. Now the tide turned against Hitler when the United States entered the war. So you have everyone over in Europe and Asia, but so far the United States hadn't stepped in. Now when the United States entered the war, the tide started to turn for Germany, and things started to not go as well, because there were fresh troops, fresh supplies, and German troops had been fighting this whole time. German troops had been exhausting a lot of their supplies this whole time. And in some war-torn areas, the areas that may have previously grown crops for food for people, the laborers who would have generally been making the weapons or the munition that you needed, they were all gone. The crops might have been burned, the land wasn't being tended by laborers, the factories weren't being manned by laborers to make more guns or provide more ammunition. So Germany was becoming a little exhausted, where the United States was coming in pretty fresh. The harsh Russian winter halted the German advance into Russia short of Moscow in 1941. So they got pretty deep into Russia, but the winter was not what Germans were used to, and it stopped them. They didn't want to go any further during this harsh winter. The Germans did make further gains in the summer of 1942 after that harsh winter, but they were decisively beaten at the Battle of Stalingrad and were slowly pushed out of Russia from then on. So once they were defeated at Stalingrad, it was pretty much a slow but steady effort of Russia to be pushing the Germans back into Germany. American and British troops landed in North Africa in 1942 and used that as a springboard to invade Italy in 1943. And remember, Italy was one of the Axis powers, another country who was on Germany's side, who was also taking over land that didn't belong to them. Not as much as Germany, but it was definitely an ally of Germany, so it was a country they were going to have to defeat in order to defeat all of the Axis powers. In 1944, the Americans and British opened yet another front with the massive invasion of northern France in the D-Day landings. And D-Day is a military term used for the day the attack is going to happen, the day you're going to land and make your attack. Now, this D-Day just happens to be known so well as D-Day because it is the most well-known D-Day in history. So even though the military may call other days D-Day, this particular day in history, whenever they invaded northern France at Normandy, was the most famous D-Day because it made such a big impact in World War II in turning the tides. Because at this point, there were so many different fronts that the Germans were having to fight on. The American and British soldiers had invaded Italy, so they had a front there. They had invaded France, there was a front there. There was, of course, the natural borders of Britain, and so anything nearby there was going to be in opposition to Britain if they were trying to come too close. And so you had a lot of different borders going on here that there was fighting at, and the German troops are having to be spread pretty thin. Fighting numerically superior forces. Remember, the American troops were coming in fresh. There were lots of people. The German troops have been fighting this whole time. A lot of them had already died, and so they weren't really having a way to replenish those troops. So fighting numerically superior forces along multiple fronts, lots of different places they had to spread their troops over, the Germans steadily lost ground. The Allies, which was the group containing America and Britain, pushed into Germany from both east and west in 1945. So finally, instead of Germany encroaching on all these other countries, the troops finally invaded Germany from both the east and the west at the same time in 1945. So Germany was kind of pushed inward, where it had been rapidly expanding outward. The troops had pushed and pushed and pushed until the German front was within the original German territory. Surrounded and with the war lost, so at this point, they knew the war was lost. The Germans knew, we're surrounded, we've lost all our new territory, a lot of us have died, we don't have that much food left, we don't have that many supplies left, pretty much we're done for. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin in April 1945. So Hitler knew the war was lost. He didn't want to face the consequences of being handed over to the other side, to the Allies, and he didn't want to face the shame of having lost, and so he just committed suicide in his bunker when he knew the war was lost. And the remaining German troops surrendered shortly afterward. They already knew that they had pretty much lost, and then once their leader, who had gotten them this far in the first place, committed suicide, they decided they were done as well. So, there were other areas that were experiencing fighting at this time. Japan was invading different Asian countries, so this wasn't the only place that fighting was going on in World War II. But Germany was at the center of the fighting in Europe, and Germany had been growing during the 1930s, growing stronger and expanding, so growing geographically. It grew stronger and stronger, taking over almost all of Europe, with only Britain left in opposition at one point, until the United States entered the war, helped supply fresh troops, fresh supplies, and slowly they took back the land that Germany had taken, pushing into the original German borders. Letting Hitler know the war was lost, he committed suicide, and the German troops surrendered. So by the middle of 1945, the war was over for Germany. World War II, Japan. The Japanese, like the Germans, became seduced by the notion of their own racial superiority during the 1930s. So the Germans and the Japanese both thought their own races were superior to those of others and thought to overcome the inferior races. As in Germany, this led to a lust for territorial expansion. They felt like they deserved more territory, and they were going to get it, even if that meant being aggressive and taking over nations that did not want to be taken over. And so in Europe, Germany became the major power that was the enemy there. And in Asia, Japan became the major power that was the enemy. And Japan and Germany and Italy all comprised the Axis powers, which were all taking over lands that weren't supposed to belong to them. And this inevitably led to World War II. So by 1941, Japan had conquered Korea, Manchuria, and parts of China. So Japan was branching out, it was expanding its territory, and it was doing so by invading neighboring nations and taking them over by force. Japan was also threatening to invade American interests in the Philippines. So the Americans were further away, but the Philippines were close by. However, since the Americans held interest there, they did not want the Philippines messed with, and Japan knew they would be messing with America if they tried to take over the Philippines. So the United States imposed economic sanctions on Japan that made it difficult for the Japanese war industry to function. So the United States was saying, okay, if you want to threaten to invade the Philippines, then we'll impose this economic sanction on you. It will be harder for you to keep going with your war and keep going with your conquering of these neighboring nations. And in response, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the United States by bombing the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor. And this is one of the most famous attacks in history, well known as the start of the war for the United States. The United States had not officially entered World War II until after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And then they were said to have woken up a sleeping giant, because the United States was laying back across the ocean, watching to see what was happening, but not really interfering in the war that was going on in Europe and in Asia. But after Japan attacked the United States on their home territory in Pearl Harbor, then the United States struck back. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan, and they were officially a part of World War II. Now, In turn, Germany declared war on the United States. Remember, Germany and Japan were allies in the Axis power alliance. So when the United States declared war on Japan, Japan would be declaring war on the United States in turn, and Germany would have to side with Japan and also declare war on the United States. The Japanese made huge territorial gains before the U.S. turned the tide at the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal. So the Japanese were still taking over territory while the United States was kind of coming up with its plan and positioning troops to move over there. So before the United States got there and could actually start fighting and turning the tide, the Japanese had made pretty big territorial gains. And the war in the Pacific, as this was known because it was in the Pacific Ocean, would take much longer than the war in Europe due to the island-hopping nature of the fight. So in Europe, the countries were, for the most part, connected. You had Britain that was an island nation, but for the most part, the countries were close together, their borders were close together, they were connected, and so it was going to go quickly. In the Pacific, because Japan was made of a lot of islands, and they were taking over lots of islands that had been part of other nations, it was going to be an island-hopping kind of fight. Once the United States would beat the Japanese on one island, they'd go to the next one. Well, while they were at the next one, Japanese could come back around to the old island, retake over it, and the Americans would have to come back and fight the Japanese again. The only way to avoid this would be to leave troops behind on each island, which meant that your forces moving forward were going to be weaker and you needed strong forces. And the Japanese unwillingness to surrender made it almost impossible for America to entirely vanquish them without enormous loss of life. So, if the Americans tried to kill every Japanese soldier on an island because the Japanese refused to surrender, then that was an enormous loss of life for the Japanese, but the Americans would also lose soldiers during the fight as well. So both sides would lose a lot of men. Most of the time in a battle, the two sides would come to a truce, or one side would surrender to another. It wasn't just a fight to the death. But for the Japanese, they were unwilling to surrender, and so often it was a fight until all or almost all of the Japanese soldiers were killed on an island before they could move on. And then in general, Japan as a nation was unwilling to surrender, and so this made it harder for America to see an end to the war because the Japanese weren't going to surrender until they were seeing just tremendous loss of life themselves, instead of just thinking, okay, well, we lost a few here at this island, at this island, at this island, but nothing too much yet, nothing here at the heart of Japan. So eventually the United States decided to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Japan to surrender. And this was an enormous loss of life right away in the heart of Japan, and it was also going to have people that slowly died from radiation poisoning and other wounds from during the initial blasts in those areas. And so Japan saw the enormous loss of life that was capable if they kept this war going. They saw the continued effects of it, and these atomic bombs did have a lot of future ramifications that were at the time unknown. So Japan lost a lot with those two atomic bombs being dropped on them. And finally, the war was ended in the Pacific in August 1945. So after the United States dropped those two atomic bombs, it did not take long for Japan to surrender. They realized they didn't have the weapons to fight back at this time. They weren't going to be able to take those big losses of life like they were seeing, and so they eventually did surrender. So where Germany was the primary power in the Axis alliance in Europe, Japan was the primary power in Asia, both of them with ideas of racial superiority and wanting to expand their territory. Japan had conquered several areas, but whenever they started to mess with the American territories, then the United States put economic sanctions on them, which provoked a surprise attack by the Japanese when they bombed Pearl Harbor. At this point, the United States entered World War II, and after a very long time of island hopping and trying to conquer one island at a time with Japan, the United States eventually decided to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, and shortly thereafter Japan did surrender, officially ending the war in the Pacific, and that would be the last of World War II.
Often when we study history, we analyze events as they occur in time. This process of arranging events in the order that they occurred in time is called chronology. In history, a tool that we use to put those events in order and show when they happen is called a timeline. Again, a timeline is a common way of showing when events occur. Now, right here, I have an example of a timeline. Now, this timeline addresses the major early battles of the American Revolution. Now, the first year of the American Revolution was 1775. So I have on my timeline here 1775 listed, and obviously the year after 1775 was 1776. I have the months listed, and to keep the timeline neat, I only list 5 of the months during that year. And then I identify 4 battles that occurred during 1775. So for example, there were 2 battles, the first 2 battles of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord. Now those 2 battles occurred in April. And because they occurred in April, I have March listed here, shown here on the timeline. But since those 2 battles occurred in April, I have them listed just to the right of March, which indicates that they happened in April. Then Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill occurred in June. I have Bunker Hill listed right over June. Siege of St. John. It occurred in September. I have it listed right over September. Now, there are 2 ways of expressing or showing chronology. One way is called absolute chronology. Now, with absolute chronology, the term absolute means exact, right on. So with absolute chronology, we're looking at when events happen on a day, a month, or a year. In other words, absolute chronology is based on a calendar. Another type of chronology is relative chronology. Now, with relative chronology, we look at events located relative to each other. So with absolute chronology, we were looking at a calendar. With relative chronology, we're looking at relationships. We're looking at when events happen as they relate to each other. So for example, when event X happens, event Y occurs. When event Y occurs, event Z happens. So with chronology, it's arranging events in the order that they occurred in time. Often we will use a timeline as a common way of showing when events occur. The 2 types of chronology, absolute chronology, dealing with days, months, years, and relative chronology, which looks at how events occur and happen relative to each other.
TT, Science data representation. Almost all maps have a key, which contains listings for all the important symbols on the map. Now, another name for a key is a legend. And so you'll find the key or legend oftentimes in the right-hand corner of the map, many times in a box just like that. And so this legend or key is going to define the symbols on the map for various landmarks. Of course, these symbols will vary depending on the nature of the map. And so a road map will have different colored lines in the legend indicating roads, highways, and interstates. It'll also contain dots and circles and squares indicating towns of different population. So this dot right here may represent a town of 25,000 or less, and a dot with a circle around it may represent a town of 50,000 or less, and a square represents a town of 100,000 or less. Now, the legend may also contain information about the map's scale. So it may say something like 1 inch equals 100 miles. However, the scale may be located somewhere else on the map. And many legends will also contain special symbols, maybe like a picnic table to indicate a campground, or a slide to represent a playground. So again, a key contains listings of all the important symbols on the map. And so this is going to vary for different types of maps. So the symbols I put in here would be for road maps, but another type of map would find other symbols more important.